Good evening, and welcome to the Midnight Watch Live. This is The Blue Room, and I am Eric Gilbert. Tonight we're going to talk about a story involving a woman. A young woman, actually. A woman living in a world obsessed with beauty, status, appearance, and power. A woman who likely never imagined that hidden inside of her was the ability to influence kings, alter history, and ultimately help save an entire people. But before any of that, she was simply trying to survive the world she had been placed in. And honestly, I think we're about to step into a story about strength, honor, and wisdom. A story that may very well encourage the women listening tonight to rediscover the beauty, the influence, and the quiet power that God already placed within them. You see, this is something of a rags to riches story, but not in the way that most people think about those kinds of stories. Because this young woman's life did not begin surrounded by comfort, influence, or security. In fact, she came from a people living under oppression and uncertainty. She was an orphan. She was raised by a relative after losing both her mother and her father. And in the culture she lived in, that alone placed her in a vulnerable position from the very beginning. No great status, no royal upbringing, no powerful family name. Just a young woman trying to survive in a world that could be very cold and very unforgiving. And yet, hidden inside of that quiet, uncertain beginning, was a strength and a purpose that she herself likely could not yet see. You see, this is the story of a young woman who lost both of her parents at a very tender age, leaving her vulnerable in a world that was not exactly known for showing mercy to women in the first place. A society that by its own customs and culture did not leave much room for orphaned young women to rise above their circumstances. And then, couple all of that with the fact that she was born and raised during a time when her own people were living in exile. A displaced people, a conquered people, a people trying to survive inside an empire that was not truly their home. And somewhere in the middle of all of that uncertainty was this young woman, a virtual unknown. She was uncelebrated and unprotected, and likely carrying far more fear and insecurity than anyone around her ever realized. And like so many people, she likely had no idea that while she was simply trying to survive life, God was quietly preparing a place for her in a story much larger than herself. Because somewhere inside that vast empire, political tension had already begun shifting beneath the surface. Inside the palace, decisions were being made. Power was changing hands. And before long, word began to spread throughout the nation that the ruler of that empire was now searching for a new queen. Young women from across the land would soon be gathered and brought into the city. And among them was this quiet young orphan girl from a displaced people. A girl with no royal upbringing, no position, no great family influence, no reason by worldly standards to believe that she could ever be even noticed at all. And yet sometimes the people God uses most begin in places that the world overlooks completely. Now, imagine for a moment what that must have felt like. A young, orphaned woman, suddenly taken from the only familiar life she had ever known, and brought into the center of a powerful empire, surrounded by wealth, surrounded by beauty, surrounded by expectation, and likely surrounded by fear. Because in that world, women were often valued for what could be seen on the outside, They were valued only for appearance, for charm, for presentation. And somewhere inside those palace walls, this young woman now found herself standing among many others, all hoping to somehow be noticed, somehow be the one chosen, to somehow matter. And honestly, I think a lot of women today understand that feeling more than they realize. The pressure to measure up, the pressure to just be enough, the pressure to somehow prove your worth in a world constantly evaluating you. And yet, while everyone around her may have been focused only on outward beauty, God was quietly cultivating something far deeper within her. You see, there's something interesting about this young woman's story. The people around her seemed to notice something different about her long before she likely ever saw it within herself. There was no arrogance. There was no loudness. There was not some desperate need to be seen, but something quieter, something steadier. Grace, wisdom, gentleness, restraint. The kind of inner beauty that does not scream for attention, yet somehow still changes the atmosphere of every room it enters. And honestly, I think this is something the modern world has slowly taught many women to overlook. A world operated in the corruption of the nature that it was first given now teaches that these qualities are weakness. And so today, so much emphasis is placed on becoming louder, harder, more untouchable. And yet some of the deepest forms of feminine strength were never rooted in this harshness at all. Sometimes real influence is quiet. Sometimes real power carries itself with dignity. Sometimes the strongest person in the room is not the loudest one, but the one who brings peace into it. And somewhere inside those palace walls, something quietly began happening. This young woman began finding favor with the people around her, not because she demanded attention, and not because she forced herself to stand above everyone else. If anything, she sought more to stay unnoticed, invisible. No, the favor she was beginning to attract was because there was something within her that people naturally responded to or gravitated to. It was a quiet wisdom and a calm spirit, a dignity that did not need to announce itself in order to be felt. And perhaps that is part of what made her story so remarkable. Because while so many around her were focused on appearance alone, this young woman carried something deeper: character, grace, discernment, the kind of beauty that cannot be manufactured by culture, because it flows from something far deeper within the soul. And little by little, the people around her began to notice it. Even though she herself may still have been carrying fear and uncertainty and questions about who she truly was becoming. But there was something else this young woman was carrying quietly inside of her, a secret, an identity that she had been instructed not to reveal, because her people were not fully embraced within that empire. And so while she walked the halls of the palace, while favor slowly surrounded her, and while people began noticing something beautiful and steady within her, there was still a part of herself that she kept hidden. And honestly, I think many people understand what that feels like, to carry parts of yourself quietly, to protect certain wounds, to hide certain fears, to wonder whether the world around you would still value you if it truly knew who you really were. And yet, even in her silence, even in her uncertainty, and even while she carried hidden fear, God was still preparing her for something far greater than she could have understood. And then little by little, the impossible began unfolding before her eyes. Out of all the women gathered into that palace, this quiet, withdrawn, orphaned young woman from an exiled people began standing apart, not through force, not through arrogance, and not through manipulation, but through something much deeper that people around her could feel, even if they could not fully explain it. And long before favor that once came quietly in small moments, now began opening doors that no one could have imagined for her. The ruler of the empire noticed her beauty first, but he trusted her discernment, and he valued her presence. And eventually, this once vulnerable orphaned girl was chosen to sit beside the most powerful ruler in the known world. Just imagine that for a moment. A young woman who once likely wondered whether anyone truly saw her at all, now sitting inside the highest halls of power in the nation. And yet, I believe one of the most beautiful parts of her story is that even then, she never fully lost that quiet spirit that carried her there in the first place. But as life inside the palace continued, darkness was quietly beginning to rise elsewhere within the empire. A hatred had begun growing against her people. Political whispers and corruption, pride, and before long, a terrible plan was beginning to unfold behind closed doors. A plan that threatened the lives of an entire people group scattered throughout the nation. And the heartbreaking part of this was the young woman now sitting beside the ruler of the empire likely never imagined that the quiet path her life had taken was leading toward a moment that would one day require tremendous courage from her. Because eventually, the truth reached her. Her people were in danger. Families, children, mothers and fathers, an entire people facing destruction. And suddenly, this once frightened orphan girl found herself standing at a crossroads between fear and purpose. And if we're honest, this is usually the part of the story where many of us would want to run. Because suddenly, this young woman who had spent much of her life simply trying to survive quietly was now being confronted with a terrifying reality. She may be the only person in a position to help save her people, but doing so could cost her everything: her safety, her position, and quite possibly even her life. And I often wonder what she must have felt in those moments. The fear, the pressure, the overwhelming realization that the quiet path her life had taken may not have been random after all. That perhaps every painful chapter, every hidden season, every lonely moment, and every uncertainty had somehow been preparing her for this very moment. And perhaps that is one of the most difficult moments any human being can face. The moment you realize that your life may require courage from you. Not real courage. Not loudness, not aggression, not pretending to be fearless, but the kind of courage that trembles and still steps forward anyway. Because I do not believe this young woman suddenly became unafraid overnight. I believe she was still very much human, and still very uncertain, and still carrying questions, still aware that one wrong move inside that palace could cost her everything, and yet, somewhere deep inside of her, something stronger than fear was beginning to awaken. It wasn't arrogance or pride. It was purpose. The quiet understanding that perhaps the pain she had lived through was not meaningless after all. That perhaps the hidden seasons, the lonely seasons, the unseen seasons, were all quietly shaping within her the very strength that she would need when the moment finally came. This was a defining moment for this young woman. The moment fear met faith. And somehow, despite the uncertainty, despite the danger, and despite not knowing what the outcome would be, she stepped into that purpose anyway. And so this once hidden young woman made a decision. She would no longer remain silent. She would step forward. Not because she was the strongest person in the empire, not because she was without fear, but because somewhere along the way she had begun realizing that the quiet strength that God had placed within her was never weakness at all. And as she prepared to walk into one of the most dangerous moments of her life, she did so carrying not certainty, but faith. She walked down the aisle of that uncertainty with dignity, respect, and honor, knowing that whatever comes next is purpose, and God holds the future. She maintained her faith that perhaps God had been present in every hidden chapter of her story. Faith that perhaps her pain had not been wasted after all. Faith that perhaps her life had always been moving toward this moment. And long before the impossible unfolded, this once hidden young woman from a displaced people became the new queen of the empire. A woman who once likely wondered whether anyone truly saw her at all, now sitting beside one of the most powerful rulers in the world. And yet even inside those royal halls, her heart never drifted far from her people. Because while she carried the garments of royalty, she still remembered the pain of that uncertainty, the vulnerability of the loss, the quiet ache of once feeling unseen. And perhaps that is part of what made her spirit so different. Power had not hardened her. Influence had not corrupted her gentleness. Position had not erased her compassion. And while life inside the palace continued moving forward, that darkness was quietly rising against her people. The whispers of hatred, the political corruption, those prideful men operating behind those closed doors. And before long, a terrible plot began spreading throughout the empire. A plan that threatened innocent families, mothers, fathers, and children. An entire people facing destruction. And suddenly this young queen found herself standing in a place where silence was no longer safe. There was no longer simply about survival. This was the purpose. And now it becomes courage. And though she still carried uncertainty within her, she chose to step forward. She walked into the unknown to announce her secret, that thing that she had long hidden deep inside, that thing that she knew could very well cost her her life, and at great risk to herself in this unforgiving land. Faith that moved her into place and solidified her belief that God had been present in every hidden chapter of her story all along. A faith that perhaps her pain had been wasted. Faith that perhaps every lonely season Every fearful season and every unseen season had somehow been preparing her for this moment, and because of her courage, her people were saved. Lives were spared. Hope was restored. And that woman was Esther. And honestly, I think there may be a reason this young woman's story still reaches so deeply into the human heart of thousands of years later. Because while the world around us may look very different today, human beings have not changed nearly as much as we think. Women still carry pressure. They still carry expectations. They still carry the exhausting feeling of needing to constantly prove their worth in a world that often evaluates them by impossible standards. And somewhere along the way, I think many women slowly begin forgetting something important. That gentleness is not weakness. That peace is not weakness. That compassion is not weakness. That wisdom, dignity, nurture, discernment, and emotional presence, and quiet strength were never small things in the eyes of a mighty God. In fact, perhaps some of the deepest forms of feminine power have always existed in those very qualities. And perhaps that is one of the deeper questions this story quietly asks all of us tonight. Does your life have to begin as a rags to riches story in order for God to use it? Or perhaps maybe your life began surrounded by comfort, luxury, opportunity, or maybe it just began quietly, unseen, ordinary, hidden in obscurity where very few people ever notice you at all. Does any of that ultimately determine your value? Or perhaps what matters most is the heart. That quiet place within you that God sees long before the rest of the world ever does. That part of you shaped by pain, by kindness, by endurance, by compassion, by faith. And perhaps somewhere in that hidden place, God quietly says, I'm going to use that. And perhaps at this point, some people may ask, well then, what does this kind of woman actually look like? Not simply outwardly, but inwardly. What does quiet strength look like? What does dignity look like? What does feminine courage look like in everyday life? And honestly, perhaps one of the most beautiful descriptions ever written can be found tucked quietly inside the ancient words of Proverbs. Not as a list of impossible expectations, not as pressure, but almost as a portrait, a glimpse into the heart of a woman whose strength is rooted in something deeper than appearance, than status or performance. And perhaps that is why this woman described in Proverbs feels so timeless, because she is not confined to one background, one personality, one social class, or one kind of life story. She may come from humble beginnings, or perhaps from wealth and opportunity. She may be loud by nature or quiet. She may carry scars. She may carry grief. She may still be healing from things no one around her fully understands. And yet, none of those things remove the possibility that God can still shape something beautiful within her life. Because the strength described in these women, Esther and the woman described in Proverbs, was never merely external. It was rooted in the heart, in wisdom, in endurance, compassion and discernment, faithfulness, and in quiet courage. And when a woman begins walking in those things, she not only steps into purpose effectively, but she steps into it beautifully. And perhaps this is what the world has slowly forgotten. The beauty was never only meant to be something seen externally. Sometimes true beauty is expressed through the purpose, through wisdom, through dignity, courage, compassion, and presence. That's Esther. That's the woman described in Proverbs. And perhaps that is the emotional thread quietly tying all of this together tonight. And what of strength or power? We often hear phrases about the secret power of a woman, but perhaps very few people ever stop long enough to ask, what does that actually mean? What does that kind of strength truly look like? Because perhaps real feminine power was never meant to look merely like domination or hardness or the ability to overpower everyone else in the room. Perhaps some of the deepest forms of feminine strength have always looked more like the ability to bring peace into chaos, the ability to nurture life in the middle of hardship, the ability to endure suffering and still remain compassionate, the ability to influence hearts without needing to control them, the ability to carry wisdom, gentleness, discernment, and emotional presence, and quiet resilience into a world desperately starving for those things. And honestly, perhaps that kind of strength has always been far more powerful than the world even realizes. Because if we stop and truly look at Esther's story for a moment, we begin realizing something very remarkable. This young woman did not change the course of history through force. She did not build armies. She did not conquer nations through violence. She did not dominate the empire through fear. And yet, she still helped to shape the future of an entire people through wisdom and courage, presence and influence, through the quiet strength to step into purpose when the moment required it of her. And perhaps that is part of the deeper beauty that so many women have forgotten about themselves, that the influence of God placed within women was never small. A woman can shape homes. A woman can shape hearts. A woman can shape families and shape generations. And she can influence kings. A woman can calm chaos and carry peace into broken places. And sometimes help redirect the course of an entire life simply through the strength of who she is. Not because she controls the world around her, but because life-giving presence has always carried extraordinary power within it. And I wonder sometimes if many women truly realize the depth of influence that God has placed within them, not merely beauty that fades with time, not merely status, not merely outward appearance, but something much deeper. Let me take a moment to reiterate this very beautiful thought for you. The ability to shape atmospheres, to bring peace where there is chaos, to influence hearts, to nurture life, to steady weary souls, and to help build homes, families, build communities, and generations. Do you realize what kind of influence that truly is? A woman can help shape the emotional direction of an entire home. She can breathe courage into a discouraged heart. She can bring calm into moments of fear. A woman can influence kings and redirect futures and help restore broken places, and sometimes carry a quiet strength so powerful that the people around her rise simply because she was there. And again, that kind of influence was never small in the eyes of Almighty God. Perhaps tonight, some women simply needed to remember that strength does not always announce itself, that dignity is not weakness, that gentleness is not inferiority, that compassion is not something to be ashamed of. And perhaps somewhere along the way, a loud and exhausting world convinced many women that they had to constantly harden themselves in order to matter or to be relevant. But maybe, just maybe, some of the most powerful things God ever placed within women were never rooted in hardness at all. Perhaps they were rooted in life, in wisdom and compassion, in courage and peace, and in presence. And perhaps tonight, some women simply need to lift their heads again. Not because they're above anyone else, not because they're meant to dominate the world around them, but because God did not create them empty. There is beauty within them. There is strength within them. There is influence within them. And there is purpose within them. And perhaps, like Esther, some women simply need to remember that the hidden chapters of their lives may not have been meaningless after all. You were never hidden. You were never outside of God's view. He saw you right from the very beginning, and He designed a purpose just for you. So, woman, live in your purpose. Be the queen that you were designed to be in and through the Master. Because not only were you never hidden, you were never forgotten. And yes, this life gets tough. And it is easy to feel buried in the rubble of its chaos. But the strength and the power that God has given you will help you to rise above it, to climb that rubble and to speak peace into the chaos. And perhaps tonight, this is where we'll leave our story. A quiet reminder that hidden seasons are not always meaningless, that strength is not always loud, and that some of the most beautiful forms of power that God has placed within humanity were never rooted in domination at all, but in wisdom and compassion and presence and courage and peace, all wrapped up in the heart of a woman. So tonight I want to say thank you for spending part of your evening here with me, right here in the Blue Room. And if these conversations have meant something to you, if they brought you peace or encouragement, or simply given you a quiet place to land in a loud world, I would be honored to have you subscribe to the channel and walk this journey with us moving forward. But until next time, this has been the Midnight Watch Live, and you've been in the Blue Room. I'm Eric Gilbert. Good night.